Some other weeks in the future this summer, if we're doing a shorter prophet, like say Obadiah for sure, but even like Zephaniah or something like that, maybe we'll have a chance to actually read some of it out loud. But because Hosea is 14 chapters, we can look at specific passages that are of interest to you, but we're mostly just going to start by kind of recapping what your observations were from reading it. If you didn't read it, that's totally okay. We'll definitely do some overview, and just want to kind of go in whatever directions were kind of most provocative, most interesting to you. The book of Hosea is one of the better known of the minor prophets because of the narrative, especially in the first 3 chapters. But let me throw it out to you all at the beginning here. What stood out to you? What is going on in the book of Hosea? What questions does it raise for you? What just seemed to be repeatedly emphasized? Let's just kind of do some kind of just stream of consciousness, just throw stuff out here at the beginning. Go for it, Erica.
The idolatry that Israel has fallen into.
Okay.
And then I guess some of my questions are like, what was more about, like, what were the specific references to those things?
So definitely one of the 3 or 4 biggest themes in the whole book is idolatry. That's the meta sin that the prophet accuses Israel of. And that's where the analogy with the husband and the wife and adultery comes in. But yeah, when you actually press into it, like what were they actually doing that constituted idolatry? They have to kind of fill in the blanks a bit. So we'll talk about that some tonight. But definitely idolatry is a central theme in Hosea. What else?
Really scandalous, like just the whole. I mean, I know it's also like symbolism and everything, but just like the entire first few chapters of.
Yes.
Like, oh, you're gonna go find a whore, and you're gonna
you're gonna name your kids terrible names.
Name your kids. God hates you.
Yeah.
God doesn't like you.
Yeah.
Like it just seems like.
Yeah.
Very.
It's very over the top. Yeah. When
I'm not sure what the. I can't imagine my church even being able to talk about that without blushing, and also.
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah. At some point this summer, because most of these are in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, which we're not reading this summer, we'll look at it. But there is this theme in the Old Testament, which Old Testament scholars tend to call prophetic symbolism, where prophets actually do crazy things that symbolize what their message is. And Hosea is not the only one who does something crazy. I could mention a couple that I'll bet, even if you know the Bible pretty well, you'd be like, oh, I don't remember that. I forget who it is. It's either, I think it's Ezekiel, but he has to cook his food over dung. And another guy walks around naked for like 3 years.
Was that Nathan? Which one?
That wasn't Nathan. And I'll compile those and we'll look at them. But yeah, definitely Hosea is part of the larger pattern here, where a prophet is called to do something shocking to get people's attention. And you all know this, not that it explains all of it. But when you're just talking to people, it's very easy for people to ignore you. When you do something shocking like that, it definitely at least gets people's attention. And so, yeah, prophetic symbolism is often part of this strategy the prophets use. And so Hosea marrying this woman, naming his children that way, clearly has deep symbolic value in the book. And we'll talk about that as we go. What else? What do we know about either the prophet Hosea or the historical background that was behind this book? When was it written? What was going on in Israel's history? And again, this is, if you just read the book straight through, it's very easy to miss all that, either because it doesn't say it or because like verse 1 mentions a bunch of kings' names. And you're like, okay, like I think I kind of remember one of these from like Sunday school years ago or in church class I took, but the names don't mean much to us. Is Hosea early, in the middle of the story, late compared to the other prophets? Anybody remember when Hosea lived and when he prophesied? Hey, Janet. Hosea is 8th century BC, which means he's one of the earliest prophets, which means that he's ministering to the people of God before the exile has happened, but while it's kind of on the verge of happening. There are 2 nations that are regularly mentioned in the book of Hosea that aren't Israel. Did anybody pick up what they are? Assyria is one of them. And then a nation that we associate more with earlier in Israel's story And it does come up in light of that, but also in the present day, it's also back. Egypt. Yeah, Egypt. Egypt is obviously the nation that Israel was rescued by God from his slaves. But as ironic as this might seem, during Hosea's lifetime, the Assyrian Empire was on the rise. And empires are always brutal in world history to the people they conquer. But even compared to most of the other empires of the ancient world, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks and Romans later on, the Assyrians were legendary for how brutal they were. And so this is a time of much fear, not just in Israel's story, but in a lot of these smaller nations. And as strange as it might seem, Israel, and this will also seem strange to us, Hosea criticizes Israel for this. Part of Israel's response was to ask Egypt for protection from Assyria. And so they were actually asking Egypt to kind of go into alliance with them in order to protect them from Assyria during this period of time. And last thing I'll mention here is there's a bunch of kings mentioned right at the beginning of the book, but and they're all from Judah in verse 1, but then only one king from Israel, although Jeroboam is probably a name that some of you recognize. Is Jeroboam a good guy or a bad guy in the Old Testament? He's one of the worst. He's one of the worst. And from last week, hey Josh, from last week we talked about this briefly, but at this point in time, and basically since King Solomon's death, Israel has been split in two, into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Which of those two parts is Hosea speaking to more primarily? The northern kingdom, which makes Hosea a bit of an oddity, because usually the prophets are more focused on the southern kingdom. And I think if you read 2 Kings, I think something like 4 of the last 6 kings in the north were assassinated by fellow Israelites. And so it was a time of incredible political intrigue and upheaval. And this is the period of time that Hosea is ministering to. Politically, it is crazy, it is tense, it is divided. And in the midst of this, Hosea prophesies to the people of God as the Assyrian Empire is gaining power and beginning to knock on Israel's door. That's kind of the backdrop to Hosea's ministry. Okay, what else? What else stood out to you as you read or as you maybe watched the Bible Project overview, which is very helpful? The Bible Project video broke the book of Hosea up into 3 parts. Does anybody remember how they broke it up?
1 to 4 and something.
Not 1 to 4, close.
1 to 3.
1 to 3. One thing that's pretty clear as you read Hosea is 1 through 3 is just very different from the rest of the book. It's mostly narrative. And after 1 through 3, Hosea basically recedes into the background and he's speaking at that point, but his story is no longer there. Although, arguably, 4 through 14 is fleshing out what the significance symbolically of 1 through 3 was. The Bible Project also wanted to break 4 through 14 up into 2 sections. And this is a little less of a consensus, but does anybody remember how they wanted to break it up?
4 through 11.
Yeah, 4 through 11, and then 12 through 14. And the main reason for that is chapter 11 and chapter 14 are clearly the 2 high points of Hosea, where there's hope for the future in spite of what's happened. I'm not as convinced that we should break up 4 through 14 structurally, because I think prophets are usually not all that linear, not all that structurally organized. They're just more throwing stuff out at you that are greatest hits. But yeah, 4 through 14 and 1 through 3 are clearly different. Let's start with 1 through 3. This is the famous part of Hosea. I would guess a lot of people, even if they didn't grow up in church, might know the story a bit, but what happens in 1 through 3? And by the way, this is always true when I am leading a Bible study, so whether to remind you or whether this is your first time, I want you to feel very free to be disturbed. I want you to feel very free to raise questions that aren't like, isn't the Bible always amazing? I want you to feel free to push back, to be a little critical, to really express whatever you feel. I was reading Mark Twain recently, and Mark Twain is always brutal when it comes to the Bible. And he said something where he says, it's not the parts of the Bible that I don't understand that bother me, it's the parts of the Bible I do understand that bother me. And I think Hosea brings some of that up for us. So yeah, what happens in chapters 1 through 3? Go for it. Oh, Janet? Or is Josh calling on you? Is he volunteering you?
No, I feel like, God encourages Hosea to take a wife.
Okay. And what's her name?
Yeah.
Gomer.
Yeah,
Okay.
And even though she is described as,
Yeah. A disreputable woman.
yes,
Yeah.
The wife of harlotry.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, one thing that I thought was helpful about the Bible Project video is it raised the question, is she already this when Hosea meets her? Or is it more retrospectively, this is what she became after they got married? Yeah, go for it.
Actually, that was something that piqued my interest when I was listening to it, because I'd never heard that was something that was a distinction. So what is your take on, like, what's in terms of, is it?
Yeah. I definitely think that 1 through 3 is incredibly bare bones, and you have to speculate a bit. And it's not, what would be a good example? Like a lot of you guys grew up reading Harry Potter, and once you're done reading the Harry Potter novels, you're left with 1,000 questions. And what does everybody else do to fill in the blanks? You start doing like fan fiction. Yeah. And I know some really good Jewish scholars who would say that like the Talmud and the Mishnah are basically like Jewish fan fiction on the Old Testament. That they're always like filling in the blanks, like, who was Gomer? What was her relationship with Hosea like? And even in early Christianity, a lot of the apocryphal gospels are kind of like that. Because you're like, what was Jesus like when he was a kid? We got like 3 verses in Luke and a chapter in Matthew. And like in the Gospel of Thomas, there's Jesus playing with his friends in the playground and they pick on him and so he zaps them with lightning. And it's kind of like Jesus fan fiction. But you're always kind of aware that like that's not the authorized story. That's somebody else talking. And so I think we can do our own fan fiction here, but I also think we need to be careful that like intentionally for one reason or another, we're just kind of left with the bare bones. I would lean towards that the emphasis is on her behavior after they got married, not Hosea. This is a woman who's already sleeping around, they're already unfaithful, but more, in part because that's the analogy, that God marries Israel and then the unfaithfulness starts very quickly. And again, historically, did Hosea actually know this going into the marriage? Or is it more that it was just revealed along the way? I have no idea. But for whatever reason, at this point in his life, he's already got 3 kids. This marriage has clearly been tumultuous. It's understood that Hosea's own marriage is an embodiment of his message to Israel. And one thing I would compare that to is the Apostle Paul in the New Testament regularly makes a connection between preaching a Messiah who suffers for you and pointing to his own scars and sufferings. That his own story that he lives is not disconnected from the message he speaks. And in that sense, that's a classic prophetic task. And one of the things that often comes up when we study the prophets, and it should come up, and I'm not saying there's an easy answer to it, just the prophets are really critical of people. And when I see people who are really critical of other people, my sniff alarm goes off for you're really self-righteous, you're really hypocritical, you're really focused on other people. And one response to that is the prophets live the message that they proclaim, that they don't say things from the cheap seats. And that's always essential to understand about the prophets. What else? What else happens in chapters 1 through 3? Marries Gomer. And by the way, if we don't get to this tonight, I will put this on email. But some of the Hosea gets quoted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the New Testament. And actually, in both Paul's letter to the Romans and Peter's first letter, the kids get mentioned. And so the kids are significant in the New Testament. What are the 3 kids' names?
Just
No mercy.
Okay, I think, is that the second one? Or is that the first one? Yeah. Yeah, the first one in verse 4 is a boy named Jezreel, which is different from the other 2 because you're not, in most English translations, you're not given an interpretation of that. Does anybody know what Jezreel means? It's a place that shows up earlier in the story, but it doesn't become significant until later in Hosea, and I wish they would translate it for you right away. Literally means he sows. It's an agricultural word for sowing, and sowing will become significant later in the book of Hosea, both in a negative and a positive way. Then a daughter. What's her name? No mercy. Lo ruhama in Hebrew. No mercy. And then, and then a son in verse 8. Not my people, lo ami. And that's all covenant language. You will be my people. I will be your God. That this is all kind of judgment language for God is breaking off his relationship with his people. And just to kind of go ahead of where we're going later, both Romans 9 and 1 Peter 2 mention no mercy and not my people. And if you remember in Hosea, the names get reversed later on. The one who has no mercy will receive mercy. The one who is not my people will be my people. And they're used as an argument for why we Gentiles can be part of the people of God, even though we're not Jewish. That those who had once not received mercy have now received mercy. Those who were once not God's people now are God's people. And so the book of Hosea actually becomes an argument for the people of God, including Gentiles in the New Testament, which is very interesting. What else? Anything else in chapters 1 through 3 or connected to that?
There's a section in chapter 2
Yeah.
where the phrase "I will" is repeated a lot, and that's like the part where like the wife comes back and they're like united again.
Yeah.
But the I and the I will, I'm presuming is God. It seems like he's just taking it all back instead of it being something that's mutual.
Yeah, that's good. And probably more than any other prophetic book, except maybe for Jeremiah, is you kind of at times feel like God is bipolar in this book. Like he's just all over the place emotionally. And he's pissed in one moment, and he's just a love-struck teenager in another moment, and he's just going back and forth. And of course, in one of the questions Hosea raises, and all the prophets do, is when you compare God to human experiences, how literally and straightforwardly are you supposed to take that? Like, is that actually how God is experiencing himself? Or is it more saying from our perspective, that's how we feel when God treats us this way? Or is it a little of both? And I would love for us to talk about that tonight as well as all summer long. But certainly Hosea emphasizes this tension between God is angry at Israel, God longs for Israel to come back. And so that gets played out in Hosea's own marriage. And so Hosea marries this woman, they have 3 children. It seems implied that she's unfaithful along the way. How often, when, who knows? And they basically get divorced in the Old Testament period. And this is true for most patriarchal cultures. If the wife is unfaithful to the husband, it's not even an option. Like, she has to be divorced and she has to be kind of cast out because of the kind of the androcentric culture. And what happens at the beginning of chapter 3?
God tells Hosea to go back and redeem her.
Yeah. And what does that seem to mean concretely?
Like he has to bring some 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley.
Yeah. So he brings stuff, he brings money and possessions,
right.
and he pays somebody money.
Yeah.
And so the options here are either she's actually a slave at this point because she's no longer under the economic security of her husband, or she's actually working like in a brothel. But Hosea actually buys her back and brings her back to be his husband, to be his wife. And one of the things that, because we're not ancient Jews, we can easily miss, is Hosea is actually disobeying the Old Testament law at this point. A man is not allowed to do this. If you divorce your wife and then she has relationships with other men, you're actually, in the Torah, you're not allowed to remarry her. And so both Hosea and God are behaving in ways that break Torah in this book, which is very, very provocative for a Jewish audience. Even if to us, we're, as modern people, like, man, women are really coming off rough in this book, which we can talk about that along the way too. Okay, and then what happens to Gomer? What happens to Hosea? What happens to their kids? Who the heck knows? You can write your own fan fiction if you want. But basically, chapter 4 begins, and the first thing that chapter 4 says, and this is a word that the prophets often use, and Richard and Andrew and Jennifer and a few others, you'll like this, is the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. That's a lawsuit word. That basically Hosea, as a prophet, is acting as God's prosecutor, and the rest of the book, in many ways, is Hosea offering the evidence that God is in the right to basically kick Israel out of the house and to divorce her. And then it goes in, and we can talk about anything you guys want in chapters 4 through 14. Let me mention, and we'll look at a few passages here. Let's look at one other theme. Clearly the main metaphor or analogy for God's relationship with Israel in this book is what? What's that? But like the human analogy. What human relationship kind of functions as an analogy for God's relationship? Yeah, marriage, romance. And I would guess a lot of you know that while Hosea emphasizes this more than a lot of other Old Testament writers do, Hosea is not unique in this. Where else in the Old Testament is this analogy present?
Song of Solomon.
Depends on how you read it. But maybe. Certainly there's a long tradition, both in Judaism and in Christianity, that Song of Solomon isn't actually about sex and marriage between a man and a woman, but between Israel and God. But definitely Song of Solomon, for some reason, is in there. And obviously in the New Testament. Where do we see this in the New Testament?
Revelation.
What's that?
I was going to say Revelation as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
The New Testament ends with a marriage between Christ and the church. In the Gospels, Jesus regularly describes himself as the bridegroom. He regularly tells parables where those who are invited are being invited to a wedding feast over and over and over again. Ephesians 5, husbands and wives are like Christ in the church. But in the Old Testament, it's elsewhere. And what I want us to kind of just be familiar with as we look at Hosea is, while the marital analogy is there for God and his people, it's not abstract. It's historical. It has concrete references. And so I want you to keep your finger in Hosea and jump back to Jeremiah chapter 3. There are many references we could look at here, but we'll look at two. We'll look at one in Jeremiah, and we'll look at one in Isaiah. Would somebody read just verse 1 in Jeremiah 3?
If a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? Would not that land be greatly polluted? You have played the whore with many lovers, and would you return to me? Declares the Lord. Very, very similar to Hosea. If you jump down to verse 8, she saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one Israel, I had sent her away, God had sent her away with a decree of divorce. This is something that I tend to find that many Christians don't know, that the Old Testament describes God as divorcing Israel towards the end of the story. If you jump back to Isaiah chapter 50, Isaiah 50 is during the exile. The exile has already happened. And this is also very similar to Hosea, where there's a mother and there's children, and they seem to be distinct from each other. And in Isaiah 50, it's speaking to the children about their mother. And would somebody read just verse 1 in Isaiah 50?
Thus says the Lord, where is the certificate of your mother's divorce, whom I have put away? Or which of my creditors is it to whom I have sold you? For your iniquities you have sold yourselves, and for your transgressions your mother has been put away. Okay,
those are just two examples of many. But when the Old Testament prophets talk about God divorcing Israel, what moment of the story is that? What does that actually look like in history? What are the prophets referring to when they say God has sent Israel away with a certificate of divorce?
Exile.
The exile. The exile, to use our analogy, is basically saying, up until now, the two of us were living under the same roof, but we cannot be in the same house anymore. You got to get out. Because you're constantly bringing your other lovers here. For the sake of time, we won't look at it, but Ezekiel 8 is not very well known, but it basically takes Ezekiel on a tour of the temple from God's perspective. And as Ezekiel goes on a tour of the temple, God is basically grieved that over here on the north wall, there's a god from Egypt. And over here on the west wall, there's a fertility god that you pray to. And it's basically saying that it's like if you were married and your husband or wife had pictures all around the house of other lovers and other former boyfriends and girlfriends. And this is the place that God dwells with his people. And so God's response is say, we cannot be in the same place anymore. I'm sending you away with a certificate of divorce. And that's what the prophet Hosea is talking about. Now, last thing for now, because obviously that's not where the story ends, and the New Testament picks up there. If God divorces Israel in the exile, when does he marry Israel? Is that just like always true? Is God just eternally married to Israel? No. In Judaism, when's the marriage between Israel and God?
In the covenant.
Covenant? Abraham is a good guess, but it's later than that. Later than that. It's Sinai. It's when God brought Israel out of Egypt, brought them to the mountain and entered in covenant. In Judaism, that's the marriage between God and Israel at that point. And I think maybe I sent this out, and again, for the sake of time, but if you have not read it ever or anytime recently, sometime this week, let me encourage you after this to read Ezekiel 16. Ezekiel 16 in one chapter summarizes the entire story of the Old Testament from beginning to end as a story of one, when I found you, you were a kid, bleeding and beaten on the side of the road and no one cared for you. And that's the analogy of you were slaves in Egypt. Then I brought you into my house and you grew up into a beautiful young woman. And then I married you. And then almost right away, there was adultery and unfaithfulness the rest of the way. And I kicked you out. But Ezekiel also, like Hosea, really is emphatic that God has divorced Israel, but also really emphatic that that divorce is also not the end of their relationship. Which again, I want us to really feel kind of the provocativeness of this. God is breaking the law in the way that he wants to bring Israel back into a marriage with him. Humans are not allowed to do what God is doing with Israel. You would be violating the law if you did this. And so anyway, that's some of the backdrop to Hosea. Makes it a little more concrete, a little more historical. Erica raised a great question earlier. Idolatry is clearly the criticism of Israel. That's analogous to adultery between a husband and wife. But what is Israel actually doing in the book of Hosea that makes the prophet, that makes God so mad? Okay, definitely some of it is political alliances with other nations, which in the ancient world also means trusting in their gods. And so Israel is almost certainly going through worship routines, rituals, prayers of actually looking to other gods for protection. One of the themes in Hosea, if you noticed it, is you thought all these blessings came from them, but they actually came from me, your husband. And so Israel is looking to other sources for what actually comes from only the one true God. And so that's idolatry, looking to trusting in something other than God for reliance, security, all that. What else?
There's this line, I forget where it is, but basically Israel's characterized as crying out to God, but God says that their heart isn't aligned with their cry.
Yeah.
So they're not being genuine.
Good. And Hosea emphasizes this a bit, but we are going to see it over and over and over again in the 12 this summer. Probably the most famous place in Hosea, if you look at Hosea 6, and you might recognize this because Jesus quotes it in the New Testament. Hosea chapter 6, at the very beginning, there's these words, "Come, let us return to the Lord. Come, let's go back." And yet, there is this frustration of God in verse 4. What will I do with you, O Ephraim? What will I do with you, O Judah, the north, the south? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. What's that image about? That Israel's love is like the morning dew. Clearly it's negative. Clearly it's a criticism. How? It's temporary. It's temporary. You have all seen, some of you have even experienced a romantic relationship where one person is very devoted, very faithful, very steadfast, and the other person's very flaky, very unfaithful. And this person, after they're unfaithful or after they leave or after whatever, then they have this sporadic, they come back and they're kind of hot again for 5 minutes and they sweet talk the person. And the person is tempted to give them another chance, and then it becomes this pattern. And God is basically saying, that's what you guys are doing to me. You sweet talk me for 5 minutes and then you forget about me and you go on to other lovers. And so God says in verse 6, I desire steadfast love. It's a famous Hebrew word, hesed. Faithful, loyal love, and not sacrifice. The knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. And this is one of the great themes of all the prophets. That what God wants is not external actions. And to reverse our gender stereotypes tonight, I find that experientially, women are usually much more intuitive about this, that guys come back and they say some cheap words, or guys come back and they bring flowers. No one's like, I don't want your flowers, I don't want your words, I want you to actually care for me consistently in everything you do. Right? Like, I don't want this cheap external brief action. And God is saying that about Israel. And in the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 9 and chapter 12, Jesus quotes verse 6 of Hosea 6 to criticize the Pharisees for their exclusionary practices towards the unclean and the Gentiles because they're not going through external rituals. And he says what God desires is steadfast love or mercy, not sacrifice, actual intimate knowledge and relationship, and not going through the outward motions. And so yes, Hosea criticizes this, and many of the prophets do, that Israel is taking comfort in external behaviors and external rituals as justification for why this deeper dark stuff doesn't actually matter, both in behavior as well as in the inclination of their heart. And so the prophets regularly, and I think all summer long, this should be something we think about and talk about. What are the parallels for us today as Christians? Where even though we're idolatrous, even though we're selfish, even though we're wicked towards other human beings, we feel comfort and assurance because of this external ritual we're going through. And the prophets constantly criticize that way of responding to God without actually changing your life with repentance. And so yes, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Dave. The external rituals. What else? Any other themes that seem to be especially emphasized, repeated? Any images or metaphors? Because the prophets are so experiential, impressionistic, not primarily logical, whether it's reading them out loud, hearing them out loud, or just rereading them often, there is a lot of repetition in a prophet like Hosea, but it's very easy to miss unless you read them about 10 or 20 times. And so did anybody notice, took me a long time before I noticed this, that Hosea is characterized by using an image negatively and then later on reversing it so it's positive. This is very, very characteristic of Hosea. Did anybody notice any images that when they first show up are negative, but when they show up later are positive? I found at least 3.
The dew comes up.
Yeah. Okay, so the dew in chapter 6 is Israel's very transient, superficial, false love. In chapter 13, in verse 3, it's what Israel will become in the future. Therefore, they, Israel, shall be like the morning mist, or like the dew that goes away early, like the chaff. This is like Psalm 1, that swirls from the threshing floor, or like smoke from a window. That is, your future is going to disappear really fast in front of your eyes, Israel. 2 images of dew that are negative, but in chapter 14, verses 4 and 5, I will heal their apostasy, future tense. I will love them freely, for my anger is turned from them, and I will be like the dew to Israel. He shall blossom like the lily. He shall take root like the trees of Lebanon. The same image that pronounced judgment and disaster earlier is now being reclaimed to pronounce future hope and God's love and God's mercy on Israel. And you could easily say the same thing by just saying, well, in the past, stuff went really bad because of your sin, but in the future it'll be better. But by doing this, Hosea is making you experience something a little different, which we'll talk about in a second. Any other images? They get turned around.
I guess while I understand what like the dew is turning around, I don't understand what the dew is now. Like if we're understanding dew as this temporary thing, how is it helping the lily blossom? Yeah, so morning dew is definitely temporary, but it's also something that when you wake up and you go out in the morning, it's also pleasant, right? It's like it's moist. It actually helps things to grow. So here it's looking at it from a different angle as something enjoyable and something life-giving. Yes, it's still brief, but that's not the point of the analogy at this point. And right, like, what would be an example from elsewhere in Scripture? Like, fire can be a negative or a positive image in Scripture. I don't know, like fire helps you cook things, fire keeps you warm, but fire can also destroy, fire can also hurt. So it depends on what part of the experience you're talking about. And the experience of dew functions negatively and positively. What else?
Can you clarify if the east wind is from God? Because in 12 it says that you're pursuing the east wind all along, and then we're going to 13 and it says, "Oh, he may flourish the east wind, the wind of the Lord shall come." And I can't tell if that's like a good or positive thing.
That's a good question. I would understand all of that as negative. Like Job, God speaks to him out of the whirlwind. The whirlwind is almost always a metaphor for judgment, disaster, chaos, like a storm. But that said, I'll have to look at that one more closely. I didn't think about whether that one is turned around.
There's also fruit. It's in end of 9. He's saying that Ephraim's fruit is dried up; they will bear no fruit.
Okay.
In 14, like fruit.
Yeah.
Something that's like prayer. That's
Yeah.
sweet.
Yeah, good. Yeah, just these agricultural images of famine to harvest. And many of the prophets, many of the Old Testament writers will use that kind of image. Absolutely. By the way, I should have said this earlier. The word, and you just mentioned it, Erica, the word that Hosea most often uses for the people of God is not Israel or Judah, it's Ephraim or Ephraim. And is that all of Israel? Is that the northern kingdom? Is that the southern kingdom? Is that just one tribe? It's the north. It's a nickname for the whole northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. I have no idea why. Commentators debate about it. But Ephraim is one of the kind of 12 that come from Jacob and becomes one of the 12 tribes. But for some reason, just like Judah becomes a nickname for the southern kingdom, at least for Hosea, Ephraim is a name for the whole northern kingdom. And so in distinction from Judah. Did anybody notice, and this will also be prominent throughout many of the minor prophets or the 12, that lion imagery shows up multiple times, and it goes from negative to positive. And so in chapter 5, verses 14 through 15, God says, "I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. I, even I, will tear and go away. I will carry off, and no one shall rescue. And then I'll return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, and in their distress earnestly seek me." There, God as a lion is the one who's attacking Israel, hurting Israel, causing damage to Israel, which again is shocking. But if you jump ahead to chapter 11, now that Israel has gone into exile, chapter 11, verse 10, "In the future Israel will go after the Lord, and he will roar like a lion. And when he roars, his children will come home trembling from the west." This is more like Aslan. Like Aslan being protective, calling people to come home. So God is a lion, but now he's the one roaring to come home and protecting you as kids come home. "And they shall come," and by the way, this is the other one, "they shall come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria." And the dove showed up earlier, but in a negative way. If you look at chapter 7, verse 11, Ephraim is like a dove, silly and stupid and without sense. So here, right, like you're walking around New York City, you see all these pigeons, you're like, these are the stupidest animals in the world. It's like the people of God. It's like us, right? Like whenever Jesus compares us, or any Old Testament writer, like, oh, Jesus is like sheep are stupid. That's why we're sheep. Or like sheep die as soon as the shepherd disappears. They're stupid. They don't know how to take care of themselves. And here, the people of God are like doves. They're just dummies. They don't know anything. But in chapter 11, here it's something that's fragile, that's precious, that's valued, and like doves and like birds, they'll come flying home. So, quick question, and this is complicated. Why does Hosea do this? Why does Hosea communicate the dark and the positive, the light, or the dark and the light, the negative and the positive, by using the same images for both sides? What's the point of that?
Is that how God sees us? Like it's partially why he's working so hard to redeem Israel, because he both sees both sides of it in that way.
Flesh that out a bit more. What do you mean by that?
Well.
No, it's okay.
Like,
it's okay.
Essentially, God sees both these very dark and negative sides of Israel, but also understands, like,
it's good.
Like the silliness and almost the innocence in that silliness.
Yeah.
And, like, understanding that there is something to redeem, which is why I'm kind of going against what he usually said is how you should treat those
good,
who
I like
are
that.
either betrayed or
I like that. If you take the book of Hosea at all straightforwardly as actually depicting faithfully how God experiences the world and the people of God, you get the sense that God's experience of us is very complex. It's not simple. And God is often understood in Western Christianity in incredibly simplistic ways. Is he's just loving, or he's just tender, or he's just strong, or he's just this. In the book of Hosea, and this is one of the reasons I think it's using the romantic analogy, I think probably we all know through experience with things, friends, nothing is more tumultuous, good and bad than romance. Nothing brings out the best human experiences and the shittiest human experiences than falling in love with a sinner. Right? It is the best and the worst of being alive. And it's basically saying that's what it's like for God to be in relationship with us. Like he loves it and he hates it. It's the best of times and the worst of times for God to be in relationship with us. And Hosea wants us to feel sympathy for God in real ways. That this is not easy for God to be in relationship with people like us, who are so flaky, so wayward, so back and forth, valued by him, loved by him, but also incredibly hateful, incredibly ignoring, incredibly wayward. And so the book of Hosea, and it's not comfortable, but the book of Hosea just gives us the impression that God's emotional experience of us is incredibly complex. And I think that's important to hold on to. A lot of bad practices in life come out of taking a part of God's experience and making it his whole experience. And the book of Hosea doesn't want to say it's just judgment, it's just wisdom and strength, it's just love and mercy. It's all of those things. Yeah, Josh.
So we touched on this in the beginning. I guess I'm wondering how oftentimes I find that sort of like human anger is based in a lack of understanding.
Yeah.
So sort of like if you understood what was going on with that person when they cut you off in traffic, then it's sort of like, then it greatly decreases your anger and you use like compassion and everything.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering like how do we conceptualize
That's a great question.
God's anger?
Yeah.
Like sort of he knows us in our being totally flawed. So like how does this
I love that question.
How does it almost make sense?
Yeah, I love that question. And this is, I think both in Judaism and in Christianity, this is a perpetual question through the centuries and the millennia, which is what exactly are these anthropomorphisms doing? Are they basically describing God directly, literally, simply as he is? Are they basically saying, no, God's experience is utterly mysterious and other. This is just what it seems like to us or what it feels like to us. Is it something else? And I feel very uncomfortable with that second answer if it's simply put, that this doesn't actually connect you to God at all. But I also think the first answer is dangerous if left by itself because it basically reduces God to a human being.
Yeah.
And so anthropomorphisms almost certainly have to be saying there's something about our experience of the world that's like how God experiences himself, the world, whatever, but also because he's God, both not human, but also perfect, not sinful, there's also going to be differences. And so this is a bit simple. But remember years ago when I was younger than everybody in this room, one of the first Christian books I read that opened my eyes was Knowing God by J.I. Packer, which I would still recommend. And he says, and this might be simplistic, but I think it's a good general principle. He says in anthropomorphisms in the Bible, you should basically take the best of the human experience and ascribe it to God, and all the sinfulness of the human experience, understand that this isn't how God experiences it. And so I remember when I was in grad school years ago, that probably like a lot of young guys and just Christians, young Christians in general, that I wanted to justify anger in my own life by pointing to Jesus getting angry in the Gospels. Like, see, Jesus gets angry all the time. And there was this pastor I had, and he said something very wise to me. He said, yeah, Jesus gets angry a few times, Nick, but in a fallen world, very little of our anger is ever righteous anger. And so be careful with appealing to that. But to go the other direction, I think we also know that you can't explain away all human behavior so that anger is never justified. That would also be an evil posture. To say that these children being treated like this at the borders right now, to say that the things that tyrants do throughout history, to say that when a man rapes a woman or the strong oppress the weak, that no anger is appropriate, I think would be deeply, deeply mistaken. And so there's something that's right about God's anger that I think we should say, hey, we all have some category for anger is sometimes an appropriate response to massive evil. But also to say, but God's anger has to be very different from ours too, because ours so often comes out of selfishness, out of prioritizing our own view and not another person's view. And so I think that's what anthropomorphisms challenge us to do, to say there's something in our experience here that's like how God experiences, but also is very different too. And so I think something along those lines is the direction we need to go. And so what I wouldn't be comfortable with, even though I'm sure there are Christians and Jesus beliefs, is to say God never experiences emotional anger. It's just a metaphor for when bad things happen in the world. I think that's mistaken. And one of the reasons I said it's mistaken is no one rightly would be willing to say that that's what it means that God loves you. He feels nothing towards you. It just means that sometimes good stuff happens. That cannot be the meaning of God loves you. And so the only reason you could do that with anger is if you're already committed to God being what you want him to be rather than what he claims to be. Which is part of what I think revelation means, which is God reveals himself to us. We don't create him in our own image. What's that great line that Pascal had? In the beginning, God created human beings in his own image, and ever since we've been returning the favor. Yeah. That's idolatry, right? That's what Hosea is pointing out. What else? Do you get the sense from Hosea that anger and love, judgment and mercy just kind of are in this equal tension in God's heart in some vague way? How do these two parts of God's heart relate to each other in Hosea at the end of the day?
Honestly, for me, it still feels kind of skewed.
Yeah.
Most of this is like very like intense imagery of Israel's like total destruction. Like,
yeah.
Like 13, 16, I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And so to have almost like one or a couple of chapters that are like the redemption, it almost seems it still seems skewed a bit.
Yeah.
Both are there, definitely.
Yep. But yeah, you're right. The emphasis in Hosea is more on anger, heartbreak, disappointment, rejection, abandonment. One thing that's maybe helpful, and I mentioned this guy last week, but Abraham Heschel was a famous Jewish theologian in the 20th century. And in his chapter on Hosea, he mentions that more than any of the 12 prophets, Hosea sees what's going on in this moment as a scene in a longer drama that's been going on for a long time. And it's true that if you've ever known friends who are married or friends who are dating, like when the breakup happens, if you just compartmentalize those 5 minutes or those 5 days or those 5 weeks, like you would look at it and say, why would anyone ever want to be in a relationship? But it's also true that that's not the whole story. And the prophets do really said that there's this, Abraham Heschel uses a word that was so strange for me, I think, right? Is God is presented in Hosea as being nostalgic for the earlier parts of the relationship, for when things used to be good, and hopeful that things will be better again someday. So it's true that like right now, in this moment, historically, God's primarily angry, hurt, all that. But you also get a sense, if not an emphasis, at least in the logic of Hosea, that at the end of the day, love and compassion and mercy is what drives the heart of God, and that judgment and anger is both indirect, derivative, but also temporary, that these are not equal postures and experiences in the heart of God. Which again, you don't necessarily feel that when you're reading Hosea, but I think chapter 11, chapter 14, the way the book ends, the way Hosea's relation with Gomer is, that you get the sense that, and it's what the word hesed means. Some of you will have heard like a pastor or somebody say this word. This is one of the great Old Testament words. And it shows up at key points in the story. We'll see it often this summer with the 12. Most English translations translate it either as steadfast love or, what do other translations say? But what it seems to combine is the concept of loyalty with romantic affection. Not just one or the other. It's not just a feeling, it's also loyalty. But it's also not just duty, it's also profound passion. And this is what marks out the heart of God more than anything else. And in the beginning of chapter 4, the first controversy, which seems to sum up everything Hosea wants to say, is that God is critical of Israel, chapter 4, verse 1, because there is no faithfulness, there is no hesed, and there is no knowledge of God in the land. That what God most wants from the people of God, from Israel, is hesed, and that's not what's there. And we'll see this word show up a lot this summer. It shows up early in the Old Testament story. It shows up all over the prophets. And you get the sense that this, and not wrath or anger, is what the heart of God revolves around. And you also know that whether it's loving a friend who's been abused by somebody else, loving a child who's in danger, you cannot be loving without also being angry in a fallen world. If anyone never experiences anger, they also don't know what love is. Because love gets angry when the one who is loved is threatened or is acting in ways that is threatening other people. And so you do get the sense that anger is real for God, but that nonetheless is derivative and it flows out of something else. That's hard to wrestle with. Other observations about, Richard, Hosea.
So one thing I noticed in chapter 4, verse 14, that I know that book overall is kind of, as you were saying, not super kind of great for, like the image of women or what females look like, but I was very interested in verse 14 of chapter 4 because basically it says, I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with prostitutes, and more and more. But just that one moment where it seems like
the guys get criticized too.
Yeah, because I feel like generally culturally, like it's, if the guys do it, it's fine, no big deal. But as soon as a woman does it, it's like the worst thing ever.
Yeah.
But I feel like here it's flipping the script a little bit.
Yeah.
So I just found that moment really interesting.
And as we continue to go through the 12 this summer, we'll continue to talk about this, which is anytime God speaks to us in a fallen world, he's taking something that's fallen and making it the vehicle of what he says to us. And so tend to be, and this is not to justify ancient cultures at all, we tend to be, and this is just inevitable, way more aware of the evils of other cultures than we do of our own culture. And so this is not to say that it's okay, but it is to say that in a fallen world at any point in history, New Testament, Old Testament, anywhere, that when God speaks, he's taking up something that we've messed up and speaking in it. And so how do you hear that as God is revealing something true there's a guy named Gordon Fee who says that the biggest mistake Christians make is they constantly want to baptize the original cultures that the Bible was written in as somehow being sanctified because God spoke in them, and that's never true. There's nothing sanctified about ancient Near Eastern culture. There's nothing sanctified about first century Greco-Roman culture. There is also nothing sanctified about 21st century American culture either. But there is a speaking. But every once in a while, you're right, you get these subversive hints. And one of them that I would emphasize is that this is already saying that every guy in the room as part of the people of God is playing the female role in the relationship with God. So there is already in some basic way, like almost you could say like some gender flipping going on here, where men are actually being shamed in the ways that women would be in the ancient world, and the female character is ultimately loved. But you're right, that it's still coming in a cultural package that I think we rightly see as deeply implicated with evil. And that's always going to be part of what makes the Bible difficult. That it doesn't fall from heaven spoken directly by God. It's spoken by God through human beings in incredibly compromised historical situations, which always makes the Bible very, very messy and very easy for other human beings to use for abusive reasons. So yeah, let's continue to think about that and talk about that as we read the 12 this summer. I would guess that a lot of you know that feminist theologians of the 20th century have been particularly disturbed by Old Testament texts dealing with women. There's a famous book by, I think it's Phyllis Tribble, and the book is called Texts of Terror. And it basically just looks at texts that basically seem like they just use domestic violence as a way to describe what God is doing in a way that doesn't seem to call into question that it's not okay for men to do this to women, even if the woman has cheated on them. And so this is something that in every moment, and of course the other big parallel or the other big example is anybody who reads the Bible knows that what it does with slavery is very difficult for modern people who believe that slavery is wrong. And so these are the kind of things that an intelligent faith has to wrestle with. And we'll continue to wrestle with it. But thank you, Richard. Other questions, other thoughts for now? Anything that seemed to be really emphasized by Hosea?
One thing that I have, just
Dave?
more of a general question,
Yeah.
is like for Hesed,
Yeah.
how do we obtain that? And
Yeah.
like, because if God wants us to have or and like perform it, I don't know what the
Yeah.
is to possess it
Yeah.
and show towards Him. How do we obtain that?
Ooh, it's a great question.
Without having to go through like this terrible. How do we inspire that in other people? Because I'm sure that in this time, like there were within this population, there were like God-fearing people.
Yeah.
And I feel like Hosea also criticizes the priests and whatnot.
Yes.
I feel like is very reminiscent of like the Pharisees and the priests
Yeah.
and the Pharisees and whatnot. So how do we inspire those around us to be?
It's a great question.
And like how do we?
It's a great question. So let me just point out real quick something you just pointed out there because we haven't talked about it yet, and we don't need to go here, but just so we say it out loud, is Hosea is particularly critical of the leadership in Israel throughout the book. And the two groups that he keeps mentioning are priests and kings or princes. So there is a sense in which all the people of God are being criticized, but Hosea, even more than many of the prophets, is especially hard on the leadership. And it's generally true that no people, no community is going to rise above unfaithful, wicked leadership. That doesn't mean that everybody else is off the hook or doesn't have responsibility or that they're necessarily going to go, but there's ultimately no overcoming awful leadership. And if you've ever been at work, in church, in a family, under awful leadership, it poisons everything. There's no pure good intention that the people underneath leadership just be like, yeah, but we're trying really hard and we love God, and so it doesn't really matter. It's like, no, until this gets taken care of, nothing else can be right. And so Hosea primarily criticizes the leadership. And if you read Hosea again on your own at some point in the near future, I would encourage you to listen for how often he especially criticizes the kings. Not to be needlessly provocative and offhand, but I still remember, and actually, Dave, I am coming back to what you asked. Jen mentioned one thing, and I forgot to mention another that I want to. I think one of the reasons Hosea takes the same images to describe the dark side of life and the light side is because he wants us to know and believe that God is involved in both sides of those experiences. Mm-hmm. A lot of theologies in our world today that really emphasize that God is loving, which I think is a good thing to do, nonetheless end up kind of saying all the bad stuff in life that just doesn't have anything to do with God. That's like free will, that's the devil, that's like just randomness. And the prophets relentlessly want us to see that God is involved in the dark stuff of life too. How he's involved is a huge question. But Hosea wants us to know that when suffering happens, when a heartbreak happens, when sin happens, God is not unrelated to those experiences in human life. And I think by doing this with the images. And so anyway, if anybody remembers that at the beginning of 1 Samuel, Israel is looking at all the other nations around them. They're like, look, they got these big kings, these fancy kings with big armies. We want to be like the other nations. And they ask God for a king. And what is God's response to Israel's request for a king? Anybody remember in 1 Samuel? It's basically to acquiesce, but also to be hurt and disappointed that they did. And throughout the entire Old Testament, the monarchy, the kingship, is always deeply ambiguous. That it's the vehicle by which God gives grace to Israel, but it's also always a reminder that Israel is idolatrous and prone to be like the other nations. And in Hosea, there's this reminder in chapter 13, verse 10, where now is your king to save you in all your cities? Where are all your rulers, those of whom you said, give me a king and princes? I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. And anyway, I remember a day that all of you will remember well, when Donald Trump was elected. Mostly because religious people were really excited about it. Otherwise, he would not have been elected. And the next morning, John Piper tweeted this verse. I gave you a king in my anger, and I will take him away in my wrath. That is to say, God is not unconnected to Donald Trump becoming president, but that is not to say that that's because he wants that to be the case. And that's a tough thing to navigate that, to say that God is sovereign over this without also saying, and therefore it's awesome. Therefore it's what he wants. And Hosea wants us to see that God is involved in all the dark stuff of life, but the question is how. And what prophets are doing is they're trying to help us to interpret it. And so in the ancient world, and right, this is what's going on in the prophets, if one nation defeats another nation in a military battle, what is the interpretation of that religiously in the ancient world? What happened in that historical moment?
Their God was better.
Our gods were stronger than yours and they won. And the prophets know that's the default interpretation Israel will use for the exile. I guess our God just wasn't as strong as those other gods. I'm saying that's not why the exile happened. It's not because God wasn't powerful. It's not because he doesn't love you. There is another interpretation of why the darkness has fallen. And so Hosea, with all the prophets, doesn't want us to compartmentalize God from the darkness in the world. How we interpret God's involvement is huge, and we'll talk about that a lot this summer, but I think Hosea is also doing that. Dave, all the way back to your question on Hesed, what word, and Hosea I think uses this word more than any other prophet, but it will often show up. What word does Hosea use over and over and over again to summarize what he wants Israel to do in response to his ministry?
Repent.
Okay. Although I think in most English translations it doesn't say repent, it says return. Yeah, chapter 3, the first kind of look to the future. Verse 4, for the children of Israel will dwell many days without king or prince, no monarchy, no Davidic king, without sacrifice or pillar, no temple, without ephod or household gods, no priests. But afterwards the children of Israel will return. And they will seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord, to his goodness in the last days. And we could look at many others, but chapter 14, verse 1, return, O Israel, to the Lord your God. So whatever else Hesed means, it means that when you're starting from a posture of where Israel was here, It means coming back to God. Now, the million-dollar question there is, what does it mean to come back to God? What does it mean to return? And Hosea certainly says what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean showing up with flowers and then taking off 5 minutes later. It doesn't mean saying a couple of words that don't reflect your heart or that aren't actualized in your behavior. What does it look like? What does Hesed look like when you return? And many of the other prophets will fill in the details of what returning to the Lord looks like. But what do you get the sense right now in Hosea? It means what kind of stuff?
Well, the line that I brought up about like prayer and words like being like fruitful in prayer, I think that's like one thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and I'll send this around. You could hear the prophets as saying, I don't want your sacrifices at all. I don't want your words. I don't want your religious rituals. But they never quite mean that. They're always exaggerating. They're saying, in comparison to this other stuff, I don't want this. Jesus even says to the Pharisees in Matthew 23, you tithe and you bring mint and cumin, and you neglect the weightier matters of the law, steadfast love and justice and mercy. These you ought to have done while still doing this other stuff outwardly. And so, yes, and so Hosea 14 actually says, verse 2, take away all iniquity, accept what is good, and we will pay with bulls the vows of our lips. And verse 2 at the beginning it says, take with you words. And right, this is true in every romantic relation that's gone bad. Words can't be the only thing or the main thing, but they're also got to be words. You got to say you're sorry. You got to say, I'm sorry for being such an asshole. That's got to be part of coming back, right? But if you're just saying that, and then you go and you keep doing the same stuff, you also know it's actually worse that you said that you're sorry. And so don't just bring words. Don't just mainly bring words. Okay? So what else? There is words. And right, like as simplistic as it might sound, like that's something that people have got to do is actually like say sorry to the Lord for hurting him, for wounding him. That should be part of our relationship. But what else?
Something about like the knowledge of God, like knowing intimately God.
Yeah.
Also helps us intimately know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that, Allison, because we haven't mentioned it yet, but knowledge and understanding is one of the big word groups in Hosea. That Israel is constantly criticized for having no knowledge of the Lord. It's like if you come back to your girlfriend after you've been a jerk, and you say, I love you a lot, and she's like, what's my birthday? And you're like, you're done. You're done. You have no knowledge, you're done. Right? Like you need to know what she likes. You need to know you need to know her history. You need to know how she's like you need to pay attention to what she likes and who she is. And so that's part of it, is just getting to know what God is like and responding to that and having intuition there. Absolutely. And so the knowledge of God, growing in our knowledge of who he is and what he cares about. There's a passage, what was it? There's a passage about, and it's kind of ironic, where God is speaking to Israel, and he says, I could have given you thousands of laws, because he gave them hundreds of laws, right? I could have given you thousands of laws, and you would still look at me like, what are these for, right? Like I just gave you a couple of hundred, I could have given you thousands. And so part of it is, and this is a big part of the prophetic critique, is I have a friend in ministry who likes to say this, and this is, you have to be nuanced with this, but you know like the 5 love languages paradigm, that everybody's got love languages, that it's like physical touch, words, quality time, acts of service, what's gifts. I mean, let's say that God's love language is obedience. That God's love language is obedience. And you get that theme in Hosea. And so, even though the marriage, the husband and wife, is the main analogy, anybody knows that the analogy switches at the end from a husband and a wife to a father and a son. And right, like just as you can't say God's emotional experience is just this or just that, yes, there are ways in which a romantic relationship is like how human beings and God relate to each other, but that's not the full picture. It's also like a parent relating to a child, And so some of you will maybe be familiar with the beginning of chapter 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Does anybody know that that shows up later on in the Bible? Where does that show up later? Sarah, you're nodding. Do you remember?
No, I don't.
It's okay.
And the Gospels.
It does show up in a gospel. Turn to Matthew chapter 2. We're a long way from Christmas. But when Christmas comes around and we're reading the early chapters of the birth nativity scene, in Matthew there is a scene where Herod is trying to kill the Messiah who is born, and he slaughters the infants. And what do Jesus' parents do? They basically take off for Egypt for years maybe. And in chapter 2, verse 14, and he rose, and he took the child and his mother by night, and he departed to Egypt, and he remained there until the death of Herod. So they're there for a while. And this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. And Matthew quotes Hosea 11. That Hosea 11 is not a prediction about the future. It's a reminder that during the Exodus, God adopted Israel as his child. And whereas the first son was incredibly disobedient, the second son who comes during this story is actually faithful and obedient. But there is that emphasis that what a father wants from a son, especially in the ancient world, is obedience, is respect of authority. And so that's part of what God wants in response, is obedience to his laws, to his commands, which themselves are focused on how we treat one another. Not disrespecting or wronging each other, not oppressing, but coming to the care and the protection of the weak and the poor. I love in, chapter 14, that there's this reminder. It seems to come out of nowhere. Verse 3, Assyria is not going to save us. We will not ride on horses. That's not how the happy ending happens at the end of the story. And we will no more say our God to the work of our hands, because in you the orphan finds mercy. That's why God is different than all the other gods. That he's a God who shows mercy to orphans. And therefore we should be like that as a people too. And we'll see this more in other prophets, that this is almost always central to what pisses the prophets off, that people with power are using it to hurt those without it. People with privilege are using it to wrong or ignore people without it. The rich, the strong, the elite are using it in ways that structurally, societally, just bring damage to others. And that's regularly what draws forth God's anger. And so, we'll fill out a full picture of this as we go this summer. But this is clearly what God desires. And also what he reflects. Any last thoughts on Hosea? Next week we're going to do Amos, but there's always more we could do, I know.
So how should we look at Hosea through the lens of the New Testament? Kind of like with Matthew, but like for example in Matthew, how people are always like, yeah, Jesus fulfilled all the prophets. Like, is that a line that we're supposed to be like, oh look, so this is the son that they were talking about, or is it supposed to kind of like you said, like change how we view that verse in the Old Testament?
It's a great question. Yeah, and how these Old Testament passages relate to New Testament passages, I quote them, is always a big debate among Christians. I like the way you put it. Is it more that like the New Testament now makes clear what wasn't clear before, or that the Old Testament is clear and now it's just fulfilled in the New Testament? And it's both at times, sometimes one more than the other. And the Hosea one in Matthew is good, that clearly it's not a prediction. It's more a memory that throughout history, God is doing everything he can to bring about an obedient son in the world. And it just never quite works out in the Old Covenant. And with the coming of Jesus, there's a decisive change. And so, at the very least, with respect to Hosea, what we can say is that what the new covenant is that Jesus brings is the remarriage between God and his people, that the divorce is over. That's what the coming of Jesus means. That Jesus has come as the bridegroom to gather the bride that was divorced a long time ago. And of course, that's where the story ends at the end of Revelation, Ephesians 5, that the story ends with you could almost say not a marriage, but a remarriage. A marriage that once existed but broke down and is now being re-entered into because God hasn't given up on his people. Any other final thoughts or questions on Hosea?
So when Jesus came and he redeemed us and did his whole deal, it's not remarriage yet.
It's a great question. I would say that where we are in the story right now is we're betrothed. We have an engagement ring on our finger. But that's where the New Testament has that tension of great promise, great assurance, great joy, but also, man, we need to be faithful. Because they didn't say, oh, I got the finger on my ring, so it doesn't matter what I do until the wedding. It's like, no, it really matters what you do until the wedding. And the difference between the New Covenant and the Old Covenant is not that God's heart has changed. It's like, I'm not angry that you cheat on me anymore. You're forgiven. That's not what the New Covenant is. The New Covenant is that the Spirit is poured out so that we can respond to God with the same hesed love that he has for us. That's the difference in the New Covenant, that he empowers the people of God to respond faithfully. And we'll get into that more as we go this summer. But that's one of the places that I suspect that Christians are inclined to read the Old Testament wrongly, that we almost take comfort in Israel's disobedience, as so our disobedience doesn't matter either, where it's like, no, like that's the point of big discontinuity. The coming of the Spirit means that we are not fated to just repeat this story over and over and over again anymore. And so when Christians do, it means that something even more heinous is going on. Well, it's not Joel for next week. Sorry, it's not Amos for next week. I guess it's Joel. I need to tell the other group that.
Are we doing both?
Yeah, I think because Joel is so short and because we don't have 12 weeks of summer, let's do Joel and Amos for next week.